Professor Edi Karni, who is an Israeli-born American economist and a decision theorist with important contributions to individual decision theory under uncertainty, social choice, and economics of information. He is a close friend of David Schmeidler and a collaborator with David Schmeidler. He is a fellow of the Econometric Society and a fellow of the Society for the Advancement of Economic Theory. And it's important to see that he was basically, even he's in our field of decision theory, economic, this theory, his PhD advisors were no others but Milton Friedman, Gary Becker, and Stanley Fischer. Is that correct? Yeah. Yes. In his early days, he was a professor at Tel Aviv University, and in 1982, he moved to Johns Hopkins University. Please.
Thank you very much. I met David back in 1972 when I joined the faculty of the economics department at Tel Aviv University. And although, as Meryl just said, I joined the department as a macroeconomist, soon after I arrived, I started to talk to David. He wanted me to teach him a little bit about what Milton Friedman thinks, and I wanted him to tell me how to do theory. And we spent a lot of time together talking, and we started to collaborate soon after. We started to publish together, I think 2 or 3 years later. And this developed into a half a century long collaboration and deep, deep friendship. His passing left a big, big void in my life. Okay, so what I'd like to do in the 20 minutes that I have, I can spend a whole course easily teaching a whole course in decision theory just devoted to the contribution of David, because he did many things, some by himself and some in collaboration with others. But rather than just describing the topics that he worked on, I would like to talk about one particular contribution. I think it's regarded as maybe the most fundamental contribution that he made to decision theory, which involved both innovation, conceptually philosophical innovation, which on the one hand, and very deep mathematics on the other. And this was the two things that David was distinguished by. He was a deep thinker at the conceptual, philosophical level, and at the same time he was a very deep thinker as a mathematician. So in this work, he combines these two qualities, and I would like to talk about it. And it has to do with the notion of subjective probabilities. So to begin with, I would like to spend a little bit of time about the general background against which David made his contribution, and I think this will allow us to appreciate the importance of this contribution. So how do I move this? Okay. So we'll start at the beginning. Around 1650, the concept of probability became a mathematical concept. With the work of Pascal and a correspondence, a very famous correspondence between Pascal and Fermat, they started to do probability in a mathematical way, which in itself is an interesting question. Why did it take so long? I mean, given that we are facing people play games of hazard since the beginning of history, and yet it took so long to start formalizing probability as a mathematical concept. And right from the start, it came down in two forms. One is what is now known as objective probabilities, is simply the relative frequency of a phenomenon in repeated trials under more or less identical conditions. So this is the concept of objective probabilities. You can think about it as a way of measuring the behavior of certain physical mechanism and so on. At the same time, probability arrived in the subjective sense as a degree of belief in an event. For example, if you have to predict what will be, where Biden will be re-elected in the next president of the United States, the conversation will be what is the chance? But it doesn't have the meaning because this is not a repeated event, it's a once in history, and yet we talk about it in probabilistic concepts. So this is the idea of subjective probabilities. So both of these concepts arrived more or less at the same time. Soon after, the notion of probability was connected to decision-making under risk or under uncertainty, and this was prompted by the well-known St. Petersburg paradox, where gamblers, and here we are talking about objective probability, ask the question, how should we gamble? And the idea was, should we maximize expected value? And then they ran into the difficulty that some games will have an infinite expected value. And to resolve this problem, Daniel Bernoulli proposed the first time, I think, in history, the idea that people don't maximize expected value, rather they maximize expected utility. And his formulation, he gave a specific formula for the utility of money, which was the logarithm, or the natural logarithm of the sum of money. This solves part of the problem. Then it turns out that you need also the utility to be bounded, which the logarithmic utility is not. But the idea was introduced. And then probabilities and decisions were connected. Okay? So this was a very important step. And then many years later, people start to think about subjective probabilities. And the idea was, if beliefs can be expressed as probabilities, and beliefs affect the way people behave, then maybe we should be able to infer from observed choice behavior what are the underlying process that is going in the brain of the decision maker, and whether it can be quantified by probabilities. So the idea of expected utility, subjective expected utility, was that when you face a decision making under uncertainty, there are two cognitive processes that start to work simultaneously. One is the assessment of the outcomes, which is captured by a utility function. And the second is the assessment of the likelihood of the outcome, which is supposedly captured by the subjective probability. Now, the cardinal idea appeared with the work of Borel and Ramsey, and both of them wrote a critique of what Keynes proposed in his treatise of probability, and they come with the idea that you can identify or measure the subjective probability of an agent if you can get the odds that he is willing to place on betting on a certain event. So this was the cardinal idea, and Ramsey unfortunately died before he accomplished this work. He published one article that was very fundamental, but then he passed away, and he was at that point intended to develop it further and write a book about the subject, but he never had a chance to do it. But at that point, Ramsey was the first, but then they introduced the axiomatic approach. And the axiomatic approach was saying there is a set of a choice set, mostly, and I'll describe it formally a little bit more in more detail later. And there is a preference relation that represents the choice behavior of the decision maker. And the axiomatic approach says, what is the structure of the preference relation that will allow us to conclude that we can quantify probabilities, beliefs by probabilities. And Ramsey was the first to try to do it, and he assumed that people maximize expected utility and try to infer what will be the subjective probability from choice behavior. Definitely introduced a different approach, which is no arbitrage, and got maximization of expected value with subjective probabilities. Later on, when they wrote the book about game theory, von Neumann and Morgenstern axiomatized expected utility under risk, which was justified in their case because they were trying to describe, represent behavior when the game involves mixed strategies. So the idea is that the opponent is actually using some kind of chance mechanism to produce probabilities. So this was the objective probability that was relevant. So they introduced the notion of expected utility, where the core assumption or the core axiom is now known as the dependence axiom. That's not the term that they use, but is now known as the dependence axiom, which basically it's a separability axiom that says that when you have two options, you compare them by those aspects that are not common to them. You basically disregard the common component. And this is the idea of the independence axiom. In the early 1950s, Savage and later on Anscombe and Aumann produced a synthesis of combining the ideas. Savage, in the case of Savage, came from definity on one side and von Neumann and Morgenstern on the other side, and they combine it into an axiomatic structure on the preference relation on, later on I'll describe, uncertain courses of action, and produce at the same time a utility and a subjective probability. And this was, in the words of David Krebs, he called it, this was the crowning glory of decision theory. Okay, against this background, I would like to start describing what David did. So, briefly, the analytical framework involves a set of states of nature, a set of consequences, and courses of actions are simply mapping from states to consequences. They describe the uncertainty because the decision maker can choose a course of action, but what will be the payoff depends on the realization of some events in the state space. And the preference relation has the following interpretation. If you have two courses of action, F and G, the F stands in this relation to G means that F is at least as desirable of G and will be elected. Now, under subjective expected utility, whether there are different frameworks, the Savage framework or the Anscombe-Aumann framework, you get a representation that involves, that says that F is at least as good as G, if and only if. Here you have the subjective expected utility of F is larger or equal to the subjective expected utility of G, where U is a utility function to capture the taste that I described before, and pi in this case is the subjective probability that quantifies the decision maker beliefs in the likely realization of events. So this is the state of the art, and then there was the critique. One critique is, you can read here, is by Keynes himself, who said that in Treatise of Probabilities, you're talking about drawing a ball from two different urns. In the first case, we know that the urns contain black and white balls in equal proportions. In the second case, the proportions of each color are totally unknown, and each ball is as likely to be black as white. It is evident that it is, in either case, the probability of drawing a ball of a certain color, a white ball, is 1/2, but the weight of the argument in favor of the conclusion is greater in the first case. That was something that is not captured by the Bayesian approach or by subjective expected utility, because in subjective expected utility, if two posteriors are the same, then you are indifferent. And it doesn't matter whether the posterior is based on a huge amount of evidence or no evidence at all. So this was an issue that was raised and was known at the time. In the early 60s, Daniel Ellsberg, those of you who don't know the name, is the most dangerous man in America. He was the man that worked at the Pentagon and released the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War and became persona non grata, and so on and so forth. There is a whole history about him. But before he joined the Rand Corporation, where he started his career, he wrote an important paper in economics, and in which he basically tested or proposed to test what Keynes just said. And he had several experiments. I'll give you a description of one. You have urn 1 contains 100 balls that are either red or black with unknown numbers of each. And urn 2 contains 50 balls that are red and 50 black balls. And one ball is drawn out of one of the urns, and a bet on red, we call it RI, pays $100 if the color is red and nothing otherwise, and the bet BI pays $100 if it's black and nothing otherwise. And the experimental evidence that he basically collected the people's responses to how would you bet, and the evidence suggests that most subjects displayed the indifference between betting on red and betting on black in urn 1, betting on red and betting on bet in urn 2, but strict preference for betting on red, let's say, in urn 1, in urn 2, than in urn 1. So the conclusion of the first two bets is that they regard the black and red as 50-50. But then why would they prefer urn 1 on urn 2? So this was a demonstration that the weight of evidence that is underlying the posterior plays a role. And there was no resolution. The subjective expected utility simply is not able to handle this kind of behavior. This is where David comes in. David basically says, the fact that I'm indifferent between betting on black and betting on white suggests that I assign them equal probabilities. But it doesn't suggest that the probabilities have to be 1/2. That was the starting point. And from there on, he developed a seminal work, which became known as Choquet expected utility, for the reason that he reinvented the Choquet integral, and also only after he reinvented it and thought he had the new integral. I think it was, people told me that Mertens told him, actually this already exists, and became known as Choquet expected utility. But the idea was that you have, instead of additive probability measure, you admit, the model admits non-additive probabilities, or sometimes called capacities. And then if you have these capacities, it gives you more room for expressing choice behavior under uncertainty. So just to mention, the critical aspect, the innovation of David was to relax the independence axiom, which is very restrictive, and to replace it by less restrictive, what is called comonotonic independence. Namely, the independence axiom only applied to acts that are comonotonic in the sense that the payoff variation across states always have the same sign. So they cannot be used as hedge against one another. So that was the main innovation in the axiomatization. And the result was that you have now a measure, integral, with a probability measure that is not necessarily additive. Now, this gives you the framework in which you can address the issue that we talked about before, that the weight of evidence can play a role. In order to do this, you have to characterize what is the nature of the capacity that will rationalize the choice behavior depicted by the Ellsberg experiment. And here David introduced another concept that became a central concept in the last 30 years. There's a huge amount of work that is different approaches to capture the same idea. The idea is ambiguity aversion. And ambiguity aversion basically says that the capacity or the non-additive probability will have this property that the probability assigned to the union of two events plus the probability assigned to the intersection is, if it's strict convex, then it has to be larger than the probability of A plus the probability of B. And if this is the case, then this model rationalizes the Ellsberg experiment, but also gives a full response to the issue that was raised by Keynes. And I just ran out of time. Thank you very much.